Our next speaker has also traveled from afar. Dr. Jacques Leider, who came in from Thailand, where he is the director of École Française d'Extrême-Orient. That is the French Institute of East Asian Studies in Chiang, Thailand. You want to pull up your PowerPoint? Yes. He is the head of that institute, and he is trained as a historian and history teacher, specializing in the early modern history of Burma, and he has published on the history of Arakan and early modern Burmese history and Buddhist kingship. He has also done research on Arakanese manuscripts in Yangon from 2001 to 2006. So we're happy to welcome Dr. Leider.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and an honor to have been invited to today's conference on ethnicity and situation of human rights issues in the country. It's also well organized and prepared, and I would like to thank the organizer. As a historian who has been involved with the country for many years, and specifically that area of Arakan, I would like to try to make basically 3 points. I think there's a need for greater knowledge on the history of Arakan and the area, and particularly also on the Muslim presence in that area, and most specifically about recent migratory movements that would give us some better background and some better information to explain the violence that we have seen over the last month. The other point, the invention of the Rohingya, maybe for some of you a little bit provocative. It's trying to make the point that I see the Rohingya above all as a political movement that has been successfully branding the name itself, Rohingya, for all Muslims in Rakhine, which is a little bit simplifying the historical reality, I think, and the invention of a historical identity that's sometimes based on rather shaky basis. History is very important. I was told a couple of months ago when I attended a similar event at Columbia University that history wasn't really important and the organizer wasn't very much interested in that. It's a great pleasure here to talk today at a place where I think some more importance is given to this historical and cultural background. And I think what's a key issue from the point of view of a historian is what I would call quest of identities, because that's what I see among both communities. Muslims looking for an identity, call it Rohingya identity. Buddhists also looking at safeguarding and the survival of their own identity and their own culture. So having said that, I'll move on to something that I see as a key concept from a historical and cultural point of view, the idea of a cultural frontier. Because when we're looking at this area, it's very particular, situated between South Asia, the Indic world, and Southeast Asia, Bengal, Islamic Bengal, and Myanmar with its Theravada Buddhist tradition. It's a very particular contest, the frontier. It's also a maritime frontier between land and sea, bridged by economic and cultural networks. That's what historians are exploring, where we see the emergence of what we could call a frontier culture, where there's both a coexistence, cohabitation, but also rivalry and competition. But cultural coexistence in the long-term run has always been a political imperative for the rulers in the area that needed to take account that they had culturally diverse communities. Why I'm talking about that? I'm talking about that because I feel that when I'm looking at the way that current events are presented by those who are specialists of human rights questions or humanitarian questions, it's sometimes looked upon as in a too narrow approach, I think, and we need to broaden and make a broader assessment by looking precisely at the historical background, seeing that the communal crisis as we have it now is in a series of earlier events, very similar ones, where the key words of migration, exodus, deportation, relocation are actually permanent features, even when you're looking at these things in a historical dimension over several centuries. Now, what we're talking about here is, in a larger view, the history of Muslims in Rakhine, in this area. Now, when we're going back to historical timeline, in the first millenary, what we know, we have archaeological evidence of Hindu-Buddhist culture in Rakhine, the history of various city-states that we do not know that well, because there's definitely not been enough scholarship about this, and we have some white spots or black spots in the historical account. We treat on more safe terrain with the 15th to 18th century early modern period, with the emergence of the Mrao Buddhist kingdom that dominated the coast of northeastern Bay of Bengal at the late 16th and 17th centuries. Now, talking about early Muslim presence, we have evidence. We have to see it first in the context of Islam coming to Bengal, 13th century, and then a date 1371, where we have first evidence of a Muslim ruler in Chittagong, definitely an important poor city in that area that we know increasingly more since the 16th century, and evidence of a cultural impact, at least in Arakan, of Muslim civilization flowing over from the Sultanate Bengal in the 15th century. Coins, royal titles, I won't comment in detail on that, but also evidence of trade, particularly the Persian inscription of AD 1495 that my colleague Thibaut Dubert, who is here today, is presently looking at University of Chicago. Muslims in Rakhine, then in the 16th and 17th century, we have much more evidence. The Rakhine Buddhist kingdom is expanding towards the north, and it's attracted by this flourishing port city of Chittagong that since the early 16th century Portuguese sources tell us about, a quasi-autonomous Muslim port city that will come under the control of the Rakhine Buddhist kingdom probably around 1580, and going to be an economic pillar of that Arakanese kingdom thanks to its rise in textile production. The aggressive warfare that the Rakhine kings are leading, it's easy to explain because it's fighting and resisting, expanding against two huge neighbors. On the one hand, the Mughal Empire that's expanding towards the east, conquering Bengal after 1580, taking several decades to extend its control over the whole of Bengal. And at that moment, those who had been the instrument of rulers in the Sultanate are fleeing towards the east. What do we know about this? Not very much, but we know something about it through Portuguese sources, because the Portuguese are talking about their rivalry with Muslims at the court of Arakan during that time, both politically and commercially. So that we see that Muslims were at the service of the Rakhine kings. And it would probably have been very difficult for the Rakhine rulers if they could not base also on these foreign communities that were integrated into a political and military structure. At the same time that they are expanding, the Rakhine kings are creating towards the north a kind of a buffer zone where they're systematically depopulating the Bengali rural areas to keep a kind of protection, that's why I call it a buffer zone, against invasions from the Mughals, who obviously are going to try to conquer that area. That brings us to the chapter of slave trade. Rakhine kings are known as having been great slave traders. Basically, there's been a political agenda behind. They've been deporting, like all Southeast Asian kings, deporting people and settling them in the Kaladin Valley to use them as agricultural labor. Many of these were also sold as slaves to Portuguese traders and were deported by the Dutch to Java. What could be called has been sometimes called the golden age of the Rakhine kingdom is the late 16th up to the 17th century, and we try to summarize a kind of political and military profile of this kingdom. It's the fact that it has a key edge advantage towards its neighbors because of a navy of several thousand ships and boats that are controlling the seas, roughly from Bengal down to Tenasserim, southeast Burma today. This is not an anti-Muslim kingdom because it's fighting against the Mughals. It's anti-Mughal because it's both using resources, whatever it can muster as resources, to resist against Mughal expansion, because there are several campaigns to conquer Chittagong, and Arakan was as well on the agenda. It's also towards its east, towards another powerful kingdom, Burma, anti-Pegu. I call it anti-Pegu because it's mostly directed against Lower Burma, where it tries to control also the sea coast. The Rakhine kings are kings that have to rule over culturally diverse communities. We've been talking about that. They are the Portuguese that were very important. They are Muslims, they are Hindu, they are Buddhists, and it's quite clear that the rulers have to express that they are sovereign lords for all these communities, and it's reflected rather well with these trilingual coins in Sanskrit, in Arakanese, and in Persian. Bengali poetry written on Persian literary models, my colleague Thibault will talk a little bit more about this, reflecting this cultural network in which Rakhine was embedded at that time. In 1666, at the moment that the Mughals are conquering Chittagong, Arakan will increasingly become marginalized because it's losing an economic pillar that was really detrimental and important for its survival. Muslim officers remain embedded in the court structure. We know that from the Arakanese chronicles. They were playing still an important role at that moment. And probably also what we can see now from recent research, persistence of a Persianized elite inside Arakan. But economically, the kingdom is marginal because we never see any English traders, the East India Company, who take any interest in this area. In 1785, the Burmese will conquer Arakan relatively easily, and then what they are doing is really decapitating the Rakhine monarchy. They take away the most revered statue, the Mahamuni statue, they take it to Amarapura. Today this statue is the most revered Buddha statue in Myanmar. At the same time, they deport the whole political and cultural elite. For example, all the Brahmins from the court will be deported, so that it's kind of impossible that the Arakanese monarchy could in any way be resurrected. What they try to do is here, which is relatively new at the time, is to integrate this new conquest into the Myanmar Burmese kingdom. I'm using here the term religious integration both for Buddhist and Muslim in the way that as Buddhists are concerned, the Sangha, the Buddhist monkhood, is integrated through a process of reform, while on the other hand, the head of the Muslims in Rakhine, Abishah Husseini, will be appointed as the head of all the Muslims of the Arakanese kingdom, which is relatively interesting in the way that the king, Burmese king, had that respect for traditional religious leaders coming from Arakan. But what's then the key event, what remains like a kind of a collective trauma for Rakhine Buddhists until today, are the massive deportations of Arakanese towards Upper Burma that provoked then a massive exodus of the population from Arakan towards Southeast Bengal. Some have been talking about a third or half of the population running away from Arakan at that time. This refugee problem in these times, so you see that there are things that are recurrent on a historical timeline, creates a border problem with the East India Company. We remember that in 1761, the East India Company controls Chittagong and the surrounding area. That leads to the creation of what is today Bangladesh's famous seaside resort, Cox's Bazar, created for the refugees by Hiram Cox, a British officer at the end of the 18th century. This is also creating or even stabilizing existing communities of Rakhine, Marma and Rakhine settlements in the plains of Chittagong and in the Chittagong hill tracts, while at the other time we do not know very much about it, but it's very clear that Muslims who ran away from Rakhine at the same time, they were integrated again into the local Bengali society. 1824-1826, First Anglo-Burmese War. 1825 is the year that Arakan is occupied by the forces of the East India Company, and this early administration of Arakan was a huge failure. On the side of the Rakhine, they had this hope that the Arakanese monarchy could be resurrected. That provoked local rebellions. Basically, early English administration was a failure because of corruption, because of an extremely exploitative tax regime. But what we see in the number is some kind of demographic recovery then until the middle of the 19th century. The British tried to exploit the area by attracting Bengali labor already at that time for their export rice production. What happens at the end of the 19th century is nothing less than a demographic revolution because of the massive growth of the population in Arakan, mostly in Akyab district, due to immigration. Two types of immigration. On the one hand, important immigration coming in from Burma, that population relatively fast integrated by local society, and a dramatic increase of Bengali immigration in North Arakan that leads then to the displacement of Rakhine Buddhist communities from the north towards the south. The modern term for this is ethnic cleansing. I, as a historian, I prefer a little bit more careful terminology in talking about displacement, but if you want to go back to that time, it is quite clear that that was a kind of less talk about ethnic cleansing at a time that these communities moved further south. Definitely what we see already, and what British officers documented only weekly, is the social imbalance that was created already at a time before the First World War. While immigration of Indians towards Arakan remained unrestricted, in the port of Rangoon there were restrictions to Indian immigration since the 1920s. Now when we're looking at the figures, this is Akyab district before the First World War, late 19th century. This is Akyab district, which has 2/3 of the population of the whole country. We see, first of all, here the population in the quarter century going up, doubling. We see that Muslim population goes from a fifth to up to a third. And what's dramatic in the way that it was presented by Rakhine Buddhists is that they themselves, they have a minority in their own country. We're talking about the time of the First World War. I'd like to quote here a book from Major Enriquez, who is one of the rare Brits that have been writing about this. He says that, and that the book was published in 1922, in the northeast portion of Akyab in the Butitong subdivision, the population now consists chiefly of permanent Chittagonian settlers. While the Arakanese moving to the south, as I said, now tend to concentrate in the subdivision of Jauta, some people think they must necessarily be submerged in time. Already in the 1920s, so some were thinking that Rakhine Buddhists were condemned to disappear altogether. Now, the term Rohingya, and I'm coming back to the term itself and the way it is used now, it never shows up in any British administrative sources, which raises obviously a number of questions, not so much conclusions. The colonial ethnic and linguistic classification, and this is the most detailed table that you can find in British sources, divides the population according to tribe or race, and we got Muslim tribes, a third of the number, as I indicated on the slide before, language Indian vernaculars, Bengali. That's the way, that the British have been classifying the population. And when you go more into detail, you rather see that it's rather confusing often, because it is difficult to compare sometimes the way that people have been classified. More questions, again, than eventually answers. What happens in 1942, and you've definitely, if you're interested in the subject, heard a bit about the massacres of 1942. Responsibilities are definitely shared. What happens is that the Japanese invade in 1942, and during that year, you have a massive movement of Indians from Rangoon who try to get back to India, who are crossing through Arakan. This is provoking these communal clashes. It's really like putting the fire to the powder keg that explodes, and there's a kind of mutual ethnic cleansing, so that the Buddhists are all in the south and the Muslims all towards the north. This is a defining moment on both sides of the resentment and the frustration that goes on until today. We have here on the side of the Muslims definitely a greater identity, and I think that's really the birth movement of what you could call Rohingya political movement, in the way that they feel like they want to set themselves apart from the rest of the society in Arakan. At the end of the Second World War, when there's discussions about creation of Pakistan, the creation of independent Burma, the reflection is there, where do we belong? Where is the Muslim community in northern Rakhine going to go? There was a discussion, apparently there were ideas about joining Pakistan. But relatively fast discussion between Ali Jinnah and Aung San, on the one hand Pakistan, on the other hand the independence hero of Burma, were kind of putting this option aside. Jinnah said that he would not support any kind of project like that. So that still left the option of a separatist Islamic state, leaning eventually towards Pakistan, or an autonomous Muslim state within the Union of Burma. So that fight is going to be fought a little bit by, not a little bit, but one-sidedly, I would say, by the Mujahideen, a fight that drags on until 1960, with earlier on a lot of sympathy and popularity for this fight, but more and more the Mujahideen are isolating themselves within the context of their own Muslim society in northern Rakhine. In the 1950s, there are some signs of public recognition of Rohingya. Today, most those who claim the label Rohingya, they're going to refer to creation of student associations bearing the name of Rohingya, radio programs. There's also some name recognition in public speech. That is invoked today, that during the parliamentary there was a recognition of their identity. But in the 1950s there's also discussion in Burma about creating an Arakan state. An Arakan state that the Muslims didn't want to be part of. They rather would opt for a separate autonomy. They didn't want to be ruled or to live together with the Rakhine Buddhists. The creation of the Mayu Frontier Administration in 1961 was a political concession by Prime Minister U Nu at that time. It wasn't really like what you would dream up as an autonomous area, because Mayu Frontier Administration was under military rule, directly ruled by Rangoon. Now, after the military take the power in 1962, the creation of authoritarian state under Ne Win, we enter this phase of what I would call cycles of repression and migration. And here just pointing to a number of key dates that you all know very well, and that I think I wouldn't get into many details. Moshe Yega, who is a specialist of Muslims in Burma, has been pointing to the extent of illegal immigration in Arakan was enormous following Bangladesh's independence, which is again not very surprising given the fact that here those who support independence and those who sided with Pakistan lead obviously to those who were winning and those who were losing. The Burmese state didn't react immediately to that, and there's some evidence on this that, at least in Bangladesh, they were kind of happy that Burma didn't go and kick out all the people who had been running away at that time. Now the point is about some serious issues of migratory movements that go on that nobody knows even today exactly about who, when, who, in what regard. And how does the state, the Burmese state, cope with that? How does the authoritarian regime cope with this situation? We all know that when we're talking about means, policies, and laws, that we are not talking about a framework where human rights were much respected. I think we don't need to go there into all these details. What we see then, a few years later, nonetheless, is that the population there is kicked out or brought to leave 1975. I put up that date because I'm referring to a couple of documents after this. But then the other key date is 1978. The Burmese government said that they're going to check if there are illegal people in the country. They did that in Kachin state without violence. In Arakan, it provoked a very strong reaction, and ultimately this mass exodus, when the army was involved, of 250,000 people, which brings us then in 78, 79 to an involvement of UNHCR to repatriate the Muslims who had been driven away. I won't get into commenting now on the law on citizenship. In 1991-92, a policy of forced relocation that probably by the government tried to deflect attention following the events of 1988 provokes another mass exodus. Once more, UNHCR gets involved. These are things I know you are well aware about. Here it's a document where I would like to point, not to make a particular argument, simply how complex, how difficult it is, also discuss a number of the issues. This is an extract from a report from British High Commissioner in Dhaka in April 1975, who reports that Burmese nationals being pushed into Bangladesh, apparently these people are Burmese Muslims who speak Bengali or Urdu. But then again, look, this document a few months later, British Ambassador Terence O'Brien, after a talk with the Bangladeshi ambassador tells it, he admits that there were upward of 500,000 Bengali trespassers in Arakan whom the Burmese had some right to eject. The issue of illegal migration is now a little bit not politically correct anymore in the current context, while even Rohingya leaders in the 50s were still ready to discuss this issue. Now, how are we reading and interpreting authoritarian policy? You all know the vocabulary and the expression, the way that Amnesty International is going to report about these events. I highlight a few of these terms. You can spot them. ANO, Arakan Rohingya National Organization, on its website presents these same events as a policy of de-Islamization, genocide, ethnic cleansing, attempts to culturally assimilate the Muslims. Is this all the reality? Is the reality sufficiently described by this? I think, again, there's a necessity to broaden our understanding, looking at other instances as well. What I see currently is the government is accused of not protecting the population. The government is normally considered as the one who is responsible for things that are going on. Actually, I think we should also see there are some real issues behind it, that the authoritarian government have not been tackling well or correctly according to laws, according to standards. That's definitely right. And that's when we move on to see the role of the army in this. But should we not also look at economic conditions, a fertile land, Arakan at the limits in an overpopulated nation, the continuity of border trade? They're also doing people have been doing business along this border all the decades in very sometimes in very dubious conditions. That's why I point to the uncomfortable truths about corruption, smuggling, that you also hear when you go to Arakan. That I've been hearing since 15 and 20 years that I go to Arakan, that people are unhappy about the political collusions that have been taking place between the government and Muslims, between the government also and Buddhists locally. And that's all creating this kind of a mess that we have currently. The exclusion of the Buddhist Rakhine in this triangular conflict is part of the problem. It should also in the future be part of the solution by including them. Because what we currently see in the description is a stereotype: the Muslims are the victims. Are they not also actors and agents? And the Buddhists are the perpetrators. This kind of black and white description is not very favorable to discuss any prospects for the future. So when I'm talking about Rohingya, I've been talking about them, first of all, as a political movement, because that's what I see, what's going on after the First World War. And in the current situation, I'm not going back to the Mujahideen, is that in the way of looking for an identity, defining an identity, I first of all see that they've had a succession of militant organization that went on until today, that he's been definitely moving towards a moderate political discourse. The latest what we see from Rohingya organization is self-determination, repatriation of refugees, and peaceful coexistence with the Buddhists. I'm not going to talk about Rohingya terrorists because that's a problem that has been real, but it's a problem that has been more involving Bangladesh than Burma. Now, when we are looking, I'm not going through all this, calling back all Rohingya organizations that existed over the last years. Some have been more on the radical side, but let's say after September 11, all this was tuned very much down, because if you want to keep in the discourse of Western media, it's better to tune down your radicalism. The problem with discussing these issues is also about numbers, and I've been several times calling for better awareness now. How many are there? When we are looking, Rohingya said to be inside Myanmar, I'm looking here at numbers that are quoted, Rohingya said to be outside of Myanmar. There's such contradiction, there's such inconclusiveness in terms of numbers, and I think there would be a need to get to greater clarity. UNHCR in Burma now, it's always using the number 800,000. I think Mr. Wakaruddin, who's been in Colombia, you quoted the number 1.5 million. I would rather side with the number between 1.2 and 1.5, frankly speaking. But even a great authority like Andrew Salz, an Australian specialist on the country, has been using in 2003 the number of about 2 million. I don't know what was his sources, but this is a serious scholar. Now, talking about contradictions here, I mean, there would be some good reason, to investigate these issues a little bit more than simply going and quoting the numbers and never trying to discuss them. Rohingya refugees and advocacy, a number of organizations I think the other people here could discuss this a little bit more, and I think Mr. Wakaruddin will probably do that. After 2005, what we see is that the UNRWA Burma office in Brussels has been strongly promoted tendency to unify Rohingya movement, which brings us to the creation of Arakan Rohingya Union in 2011. Who are the Rohingyas? Based on the diverse historical background of an old Muslim community that's increasing to greater Bengali immigration during the 19th century, we definitely have here the awareness of a distinctive Muslim identity built on a cultural legacy, collective memory, and also a linguistic specificity. There is some good reason for developing an identity of themselves. Where I, as a historian, have big problems with is the building of Rohingya identity now is that amounts sometimes to reinterpreting and inventing a history for their own needs. So I'm not going into details of the language, because I think that will come in the next presentation. But looking here at what I see much more critically as the reinterpretation of Rakhine history as a predominantly Muslim history, what I find in the writings of those who run as Rohingya, under Rohingya label as historians. Everything that has been written about Muslim and Bengali related to Rakhine history is suddenly just simply interpreted as Rohingya. That's not bringing us further to greater transparency about the past. They're also confusing definitions of ethnicity. I agree, academically, this is problematic, and you can have forums and discussions on definitions itself, but simply disregarding the Buddhist character of the kingdom, rewriting kind of Rohingya history by simply excluding the other in the history, that's not going to take us to a better understanding of the past. In contrast to that, Buddhist Rakhine identity. The Buddhist Rakhine, they identify very, very strongly with their country as well, with the territory. I have been referring to the symbolic nature of the Mahamuni statue that has been deported, that we felt that they took their heart out of their country. Arakan is considered by Buddhists as the cherished land of Buddhist teaching, because they claim that rather than in Burma, the Buddha themselves came to Arakan. This is national mythology. There's a right for national mythology, definitely. It is simply necessary that we see this evidence when we are talking about current issues, how people are feeling about themselves. Their shared memory is definitely oriented towards the past. Talk to Rakhine and you feel this pride of the early urban culture, the pride of the glorious kingdom. The Rakhine, right, they are close to the Burmans, but if they have a shared written language and a shared religion, they do not have shared heritage. They're still a distinctive ethnic group within the Union of Myanmar. The historical trauma is something that is rarely referred to. In the collective memory of the Rakhine, this feeling that they have been deprived of their cultural identity by the conquest, by the submission inside Burma, led to what we see in the late 19th century as a social decline. There was widespread opium addiction in Arakanese society in the 19th century. The Arakanese literature in the 19th century that I call here prophetic literature, it shows that there was a kind of feeling of that Rakhine was in a constant process of decline. And ultimately, this failure to resist the displacement of the people inside due to this constant immigration is part of this feeling that led to this self-isolation, this mistrust, this xenophobia that is criticized today, often under simplified label of racism. Now, what I see here is then in this process of quest of identities, of saving your identities, a constant competition. And they are like mutually exclusive narratives. The Buddhist authors write the Muslims out of the historical narrative, while the Muslim authors on the other side are marginalizing the Buddhist character of Rakhine. This is a kind of writing of sectarian history. I've been pointing where Professor Baha is here today, so it's not like kind of hitting at Professor Baha, but what I see is this kind of attacking each other, or rather attacking on a kind of simplified version of interpreting the history. I think this is kind of black and white portraying of Rakhine past that is not, it's not very useful in this kind of discussion. But what I criticize much more is then in the current reports, that we hear about the whole issue is that the foreigners, that means the Westerners who are writing about the context now, they uncritically receive anything that is said by one side and not trying to see a more complex context here, what I actually stand up here to try to do in a way. Because this is an unqualified presentation of history, and I think that history is important because it's important with all these things that we can read currently about the past and about the roots of these problems. I'm not going into some of these presentations here, but there are a lot of contradictions here, for example, about the ethnic roots. I take here a quotation from Habib Siddiqui, who talks about Rohingya, saying they are neither Chittagonians nor are they Bengalis. Now, maybe Mr. Habib Siddiqui is writing from a vantage point far away. When I'm looking Abu Anin, whom I met 2 weeks ago in Yangon, I've been discussing a lot with history, and he's, for me, one of the rare Rohingya authors who is really serious about writing history. He says Rohingya are mixed race, where the culture of native Bengali has a major influence, much more close to what historians will probably get to. So I think I'm much over my time already, and I should conclude here and not getting into perspectives and other subjects. Thank you very much.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.